Yeah, 10.
Okay, welcome everybody. It's very nice to see you all here. It's a wonderful occasion for the European Study Center, and it's a pleasure for me personally. I'm Othon Anastasakis, by the way, the director of the European Study Center, for those who don't know me. This is our most prestigious event of the year, and it is a central opportunity to bring very eminent personalities, academics, politicians to deliver the speech. Now, this year, in the spirit of our true tradition of bringing eminent speakers, we have invited one of the leading historians, Professor Charles Maier from Harvard University. Welcome, Professor Maier. Now, Charles Maier is the Leverett Satterthorne Research Professor of History at Harvard University, with a long and distinguished career. From 1991 until 2002, he was a Krug Foundation Professor of European Studies and also served as director of the MINDA, the Gensberg Center for European Studies. Professor Maier graduated from Harvard College, studied at St. Antony, so this is a welcome back event for us and for him, although he's been here on a number of occasions. And as a student before returning back to Harvard, where he finished his PhD. He taught there, then he went to Europe as a visiting professor in German Federal Republic, then served as associate professor at Duke University before returning to Harvard as professor of history, Krug Foundation Professor of History, and then the first level Satterthorne Professor of History until his retirement in 2019. Together with Professor Beckert, he directs the Weatherhead Initiative on Global History, a program that funds student research and postdoctoral exchanges, and runs an ongoing seminar on topics that span different world regions. His academic writing is prolific, ambitious, and diverse, and includes books which are breakthroughs in the field and show the breadth and depth of his historical knowledge. Just to name a few, his book, Recasting Bourgeois Europe, his first book, looks at the stabilization in France, Germany, and Italy after World War I, and that has become a classic in European history. His book, The Unmasterable Past, History, Holocaust, and German National Identity, where Professor Maier presents sophisticated and comprehensive assessment of the German debate on the Hitler era and the murder of European Jews, their legacies and political implications in Germany. In his book, The Solution, the Crisis of Communism and the End of East Germany, he recounts the history and demise of East Germany by looking at the country that finished combining archival research as historian and as a participant observer. On global history, once within borders, territories of power, wealth, and belonging since 1500. This is about borders and territories, not just in Europe and North America, but also around the world. And his latest book, 2023, very recently published, looks at the two world wars, paths to project state of the 20th century in its democratic or dictatorial forms, to the current ascent of populism and authoritarianism, all of which sought to not just to retain power, but also transform societies in the context of global capitalism. Now, the references and comments to the work are numerous, reviews that includes terms such alternative history, innovative, intriguing, sophisticated, synthetic, comparative, analytical. No wonder why Professor Maier is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a recipient of the John Seymour Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship, an Alexander von Humboldt Research Prize Fellowship, the Cross of Honor of the German Federal Republic, and the Cross of Honor for Science and Art of the Republic of Austria. On a more personal note, and following my own discussions about Professor Maier with his Harvard colleagues, I quote, "Charlie is one of the most prolific historians at Harvard. He is known to burn the midnight oil, tolling away late in the evening, into the wee hours of the morning, his office stacked with books from floor to ceiling. As emeritus, he continues to teach and advise students, a wonderful colleague esteemed by his students, fellow faculty, and staff. Now, I think all this goes to show how grateful and honored we are for his presence here. Today, he will be talking about beyond civil society, renewing the traditions of reform in Europe. And before I finish, I would like to add a warm welcome from the fellows of this center, and thank you to Julie Adams for having organized this important event for us today. It is also online, so some people are attending this online. Professor Maier, over to you.
Thank you for that generous introduction, and thanks for this invitation to give this annual lecture. It's a great honor to be asked back here. It's lovely to see many old friends here and colleagues. And I was fresh out of Harvard College in 1960, when one of my informal advisors suggested that I take my what was called a Henry Fellowship to read with James Joll at this relatively new graduate college, St. Antony's. St. Antony's was a far more austere establishment then than it is today. We ate in the basement of the chapel over there, and it was a male society. Still, I made good friends, and personal celibacy was attenuated since my undergraduate girlfriend from Radcliffe, later my first wife, passed away 10 years ago. Pauline was conveniently a Fulbright student at the London School of Economics. Now, it really took me aback to realize that I am slightly more removed in time from that year at St. Antony's, 1960-61, than at the time when I was a student I would have been from the death of Queen Victoria. Supermac was prime minister. The Tories had won, I believe, their third straight election, and two Labor dons, Mark Abrams and Richard Rose, had published their plaintive pamphlet, Must Labor Lose? Alas, the answer seemed to be yes. During the vacation between winter and spring term, my fiancée, Pauline, and I went to Paris and experienced the uprisings of General Salon and the other putschists resisting General de Gaulle's effort to exit the Algerian war. In the United States, John Kennedy was beginning his administration, while Nikita Khrushchev was presiding over the so-called thaw in the Cold War. I'm not used to, if I drop this microphone, please wave if you can hear me, because it's a rather variable amplifier.
We think it's probably not on. There's no.
It says it's on.
It's on.
It's on. Yeah. I'll have to give it this sort of Bruce Springsteen. I remember a massive CND demonstration in London with Bertrand Russell sitting defiantly in Parliament Square. Pauline and I were married at the end of summer term here in Oxford, church across the river, and reception here. The Bursts of Fred arranged it. And after a brief honeymoon in the west of England and Wales, we took advantage of the thaw to drive with two accompanying friends through Poland and the Soviet Union for a month. Warsaw to Minsk to Smolensk and Moscow, thence to Novgorod and then Leningrad, staying at newly opened and affordable in-tourist tent sites. But let me jump forward from those years so long ago to 1989, that marvelous year of apparent liberation in Eastern and Central Europe. Tim Garden-Ash, who helped to arrange this lecture, has chronicled it from up close and indeed provided further memories in a recent edition of the New York Review of Books and his new book, Homelands. I was not personally present in Berlin until early in 1990. My editor at Princeton University Press called me in December 1989 and asked me to do a quick book on what was happening in East Germany. This was an exciting challenge. Unfortunately, unlike him, I guess, like others do, I don't do quick. My study at the end of the GDR and German reunification appeared only in 1997. Being a tortoise rather than a hare, however, allowed me to exploit the archives of the German party state, transferred during the 1990s from the old Central Committee building, which indeed had long history. It originated as an Aryanized department store before World War II, to the German Federal Archives established after unification in the former Cadet and Anstalt, or Officers Training Academy, in which Feldman and many of you have worked there. Most regimes can hide their dirty laundry for 30 years or more. But thanks to the civic movements that had spearheaded the GDR protests in 1989, East Germany leaders had their ministerial and party records opened very quickly. Today, I want to reflect on some of the political changes that have taken place in the generation since 1989, now a third of a century ago. And I want to do so without succumbing to what Germans for more than a decade called nostalgia, and what might generally be thought of as post-revolutionary melancholy. Transformations of political language, I think, provide a way into this analysis. In 1989, and for some years thereafter, civil society was the key concept that Western political analysts, certainly American and British analysts, applied to understand the transformations of Eastern Europe. The Germans came to call the Wende, or the turning point, the term they'd already used for the switch from an SPD-led coalition, the return of the Christian Democrats in 1982. Civil society referred to the non-governmental social organizations that persisted even under party control and infiltrated by informers, trade unions and churches, but also the informal networks of intellectuals. In its sense, as a force of opposition, the term civil society may have been first coined by Jacek Kuron of the Polish Workers' Defense Committee Corps, which emerged in 1976. I'm not certain about that. I'm not at home in Slavic languages, but certainly as it was translated into English, the concept was broader than the German Bürgerliche Gesellschaft, and indeed German historians have adopted Zivile Gesellschaft to convey its meanings. It implied a far more intense engagement with democracy than ordinary parliamentary representation. The 1960s slogan, American slogan of participatory democracy, adopted by the Students for a Democratic Society, catches more of its thrust. Václav Havel believed that, quote, traditional parliamentary democracy could not really oppose the repressive tendencies inherent in technological civilization and consumer society. The Czech Catholic philosopher Václav Benda called for creating parallel structures, by which he meant autonomous organizations independent of the official ones that the party had colonized. Civil society thus suggested a network of organizations that managed to preserve free thought and political planning, even when infiltrated by secret police informers, and there were more in the GDR than elsewhere. It certainly went beyond what West German official Günter Gauss had called the niche society, in which East Germans allegedly found private areas of discussion or activity that allowed some autonomy, but did not challenge their political system. Rather, civil societies, its views comprised what might be called a quasi-public sphere that only in Poland, and briefly for that in 1980-81, could become public. Still, during the years of late communism, what I use as a general term, communism, after 1968, the energies of civil society apparently flowed under the surface, party-dominated organizations. I have a space-age image of the supposed water that allegedly flows underneath the ice and the frozen gas of Jupiter's and Saturn's moons. Civil society had an exciting and benevolent ring. It could be mobilized without violence. It was to be mobilized without violence. Its public personalities and nurtured an underground quasi-public sphere of edgy newspapers, cabaret, and Western pop music, Civil society was where the action was. Its energies could not be stifled by the official apparatus. The manifestations of civil society progressed beyond the courageous individual dissidents who had faced persecution in the 1960s and 70s, such as Andrei Sakharov, the Soviet Union. In 1975, the negotiations following from détente that produced the so-called third basket of the Helsinki Accords induced the Soviets to agree to freedom of expression in return for recognition of the state borders in Europe. They thought that freezing essentially recognition of the East German status quo would let them sign on the line for what they I don't think they'd ever realize would be the powerful effects of this agreement. It was unclear that the Soviets meant to keep the pledge, or even that they understood its implications. Czech intellectuals quickly seized on the dubious promise to publish their Charter 77, a group pledge of dissent. In East Germany, the 1980s witnessed the emergence of groups. And this is the dissent of the 80s is now one of groups, which is why it goes beyond the 60s. Ecologically minded networks, church congregations, and peace organizations that the regime viewed relatively benevolently. As the Stasi, the East German secret police, reported about one troublemaker whom they followed, he was leader of the church-affiliated Peace Circle of Berlin, Friedrichsfeld, organizer of Bicycle Path and other environmental action groups, likewise a key figure in interregional human rights seminars, co-producer of blues fairs and of peace workshops. The regime watched these semi-organized circles of protest percolate, but without feeling any brave alone. Surveillance merged with security. Far more consequentially, in Poland, the Gdansk workers' protest, led by Lech Walesa, led to the formation of Solidarity, of Solidarność, the union that mobilized and managed briefly to unify the opposition. In succeeding years, there would be a debate. I'm sure many of you followed it along the way. Was it the workers who mobilized the intellectuals, or the intellectuals who provided the theoretical vision of an alternative future, who played the more critical role in opposing the regime? What was apparent was the fruitfulness of the fusion. The movement spread rapidly during 1980 and 80 and 81, while the Communist Party hemorrhaged members. Implying that Russia would soon intervene, General Jaruzelski imposed martial law at the end of it in 1981 and in 1982. But within a few years, it was becoming clear that the party could no longer really stabilize an economy by means of repression. Both sides wanted to avoid violent clashes, as did the new leader of the Kremlin, Mikhail Gorbachev. By 1987, the Poles had established the institution that became key to the peaceful transition out of communism throughout Central Europe, the Round Table, which recognized the representatives of the unofficial groups as governmental representatives. Round tables would allow civil society to find a sanctioned voice. They set up a sort of dual power, itself recalling the standoff in St. Petersburg between the two revolutions of 1970. Indeed, in the spring of 1990, the East Germans had their own round table as well as party elections. But as the communist regimes yielded and allowed elections that voted the parties out of power, these civil society groups did not fare well. In Poland, they splintered into more or less party-like formations. No surprise, because of the deep hold that traditional religion in Poland had over roughly half the opposition. But they did not do well elsewhere. Electoral results were disappointing. Neues Forum and the outgoing GDR scored badly, as the West German parties quickly structured the political arena in the East. Civic Forum in Czechoslovakia self-divided into neoliberal and more socially democratic inclined alternatives. Still, in the decade of the 1990s, the idea of civil society retained its emancipatory glow. The heroes of 1989 were feted in the West. They all passed through my Center for European Studies. I'm sure many of them were here. The concept reduced studies of the so-called transition, that pale and domesticated term for a great political emancipation, and at least one massive philosophical tract in English by Andrew Arado and Gene Cohen, geared to explicate comment on civil society. Its leaders remained revered monuments, but politically neutralized. Václav Havel, increasingly isolated as president in the Czech castle, the leaders of KOR administering an ordinary pluralist political system in Poland, and the East German leaders either absorbed into the traditional parties or remaining church leaders or environmental activists. 1989, 1990 seems very long ago, but of course, so did 1789 and 1850, when reactionary monarchies were making peace with the post-imperial France. And so did 1848 and 1870, when realpolitik had supplanted the so-called springtime of the people. And alas, so today does the Arab Spring of a dozen years ago. Even when not suppressed by military force, transformative moments are hard to maintain. Still, for all of that, what remains striking to me is, at least in my political culture, is the great silence into which the notion of civil society has fallen. If we seek the fate of this concept today, it has either disappeared or been simply banalized in America and probably in England too. The question that motivates my reflection tonight is thus, what happened to civil society? And following upon that, how might we recover the energies for reform that it briefly incorporated? The historical task is to figure out why civil society faded, and the political task, for those of us who believe in the need for social progress, is to find a substitute. My response to the first question, briefly stated, is really a restatement of what happened. Civil society was the necessary historical agent that helped to shatter the stultifying regimes based on Marxist-Leninism in the 1980s, but it proved incapable of sustaining reformist politics in the decades. The unions, associations, intellectuals could resist but could not govern. Indeed, it quickly lost its transformative energy once democracy returned to East Central Europe. Civil society did not help those who welcomed its promise to conduct politics once dictatorship was dismantled. It has remained in the States and much of it here too, perhaps as a bland phrase to orient foundation programs. It no longer incorporates a vision of politics, but instead yielded to neoliberal programs and a faith in capital. Why did civil society lose its capacity to allow interference? Let us think further then about civil society. It was rebellious. Its advocates lived in a world where all authority had become abusive and arbitrary. Its task was not to forge compromises, but to establish an alternative legitimacy. Late communist power was based on corruption, that is, a selective privilege, as well as on violence and the threat of prisons and prison. None of the emerging leaders in the 1980s had served in government. The leaders of civil society had faced jail time. They were, in some sense, more prophets than politicians. As Havel said in his famous essay, they wanted to live in truth. In the GDR, the Protestant churches, which had negotiated with earlier truce with the regime, the church in socialism, could serve as a natural foyer, enclaves of moral resistance whose parsons formed a cadre of leadership, in part because education for the ministry was one branch that did not require Marxist social science preparation. With some exceptions, church official Manfred Stolpe in East Germany, for example, their motive for protest was not negotiation, but civil disobedience. And we can trace their inspiration from Gandhi and Martin Luther King. I have an essay in the collection that Tim co-edited on this use of civil resistance, disobedience. They learned the patience needed for nonviolence. Of course, there were intellectual precedents for the concept of civil society. Montesquieu, Adams Ferguson, James Madison, Hegel, and Tocqueville had all theorized the world of association, interest groups, and commercial activity as differentiated from the realm of state power. As a young sociologist in the 1950s, the later master of this college, Ralph Dahrendorf, proposed similar theories of conflict groups. But 18th and 19th century defenders of liberal pluralism had never faced parties with totalitarian pretensions. The slogan of civil society arose in political systems that aspired not merely to control opposition, but to permeate any alternative to the ruling party. Perhaps the concept faded because it completed its mission. Perhaps its inspiration simply faded with time. Societies cannot preserve a sense of living heroically forever. As Charles Péguy wrote about the Gray Facade Coalition in the late 19th century France, tout commence en mystique et finit en politique. The leaders who emerged in the 1980s were condemned to live as ordinary politicians. Havel seemed increasingly plaintive in the Prague Castle, confronting Václav Klaus. Lech Wałęsa shed his perky defiance for a role as curmudgeonly mentor. Many of the East German protesters either grumbled at the outcome of unification or went into non-political vocations. Major socioeconomic developments also came to overshadow the triumph of 1989. In the past 30 years, we've all been living through the flood tide of digital technology and its social impact, and the political forces that have been most adept at exploiting its possibilities have no real interest in awakening a vibrant civil society. Until recently, we have also lived through the ascendancy of globalization, the conviction that economic interchange, including the movements of goods, capital, and labor, and ideas, would maximize our well-being. But we have also come to understand that this heady progress would undermine the security that masses of citizens have come to enjoy. The discomfort of many East Germans after unification reflect in part their being cast not only into a wealthy West German society, but into an onrushing project of globalization from which their cozy authoritarian state had protected them. As part of the Comecon or Soviet-dominated economic sphere, they seemed a socialist powerhouse. After unification, they emerged as a rust belt. Most fundamentally, late 20th century civil society was implicitly conceived as an adversarial structure. It made sense only in its dialectical relationship with a repressive government, which raises the large question that we will also confront today. How do we envisage a program for governing? How do we replace the energetic civic activism that helped bring down communism if civil society is no longer a live concept? Perhaps it is time to reevaluate the transformative capacity of the state and party politics. In my very recent effort to rethink the history of the past 100 years, the Project State and its rivals, kindly cited by Othon, I have focused on episodes of rapid political and economic reform and the role they played, whether in democratic or authoritarian polities. I have called them Project States, episodes of state activism called up to energize political systems in times of economic crisis or wartime, epochs of patriotic exertion. Project States exist for good or evil. The New Deal was one such, the Third Reich another. So too were the French and Spanish Popular Fronts, and so I believe the British Labour government of 1945. I have also tracked their historical role as compared with other major forces that shape how we govern ourselves today. Most notably, what I call the web of capital and the realm of governance. The web of capital is an obvious designation. It encompasses the industries, banks, speculative funds that constitute modern economic life. The digital revolution has made them into a major force for growth and vitality over the last 40 years. Computers and their components, digital circuits, chips have become a crucial sector. And not only have they contributed to leading sectors of innovation and employment, they have also facilitated a transformation of retail distribution and even more a revolution in finance. Financial firms, including insurance and real estate, have jumped from roughly 10% of our advanced economy's GDP in 1947 to 25% by 2020. In so doing, they have enabled the growth of speculative opportunity, of investment funds that have enabled us to make wagers on the future into a continuing element in the distribution of income today. They have also, in the process, enabled the multiplication of fantastic fortunes and increased the inequality of income at the present. Many have been left relatively behind in this new gilded age, as we have developed a system of education and credentialing that intensifies the perception that contemporary society is dividing into winners and losers. The skewing of economic returns, unsurprisingly, increased the opportunity for savvy political leaders to construct electoral coalitions that drew on grievances born of sentiments of being systematically ignored and undervalued, namely those we call populists. Viktor Orban is not my favorite politician, obviously, but he did describe after 2014, he reflected historically. He identified the end of World War I and of World War II and the transformation of 1989-90 as the three major changes of the 20th century. And he declared that the changes in the 21st century, which is really just getting underway, had similar value and weight. The point, quote, the point when it became clear was the Western financial crisis of 2008-2009. The most pressing challenge it created, Orban explained in 2014, was quote, the race to invent a state that is most capable of making a nation successful. The stars were Singapore, China, India, Turkey, and Russia. Orban's values are not our values, and his notion of success is avowedly, to use his own term, illiberal. If Orban wants to build his regime, around the state, we should take note. That is, I think, where reformers must fight as well. The populist regime, he and others, Modi, Erdogan, Trump, home in America, the regime they have sought to build is a state without norms. Thus, attacks on the courts are an integral strategy. Populism posits a virtuous people that must defeat elitist forces that would stand in its way through outworn institutions. This is the battle that allegedly takes place at the level of the state and which denies the role of independent civil society institutions. In terms the 18th century theorists would understand, populism seeks to level intermediate bodies and intermediate structures. Populism compels us to re-examine the other fashionable contemporary term that reveals our situation, and that is governance. Along with the ambitious project state and the web of capital, the diverse agencies that claim to specialize in governance, NGOs, foundations, universities, think tanks, etc., all our institutions where we are all at home, play a key role in our political systems. But governance is not the same as government. Like the term civil society after 1989, governance is a concept, a term that has really made its fortune in the English language, certainly since the 1980s, and has continued to thrive. An engram of American publications suggests a more than tenfold increase in publications. To our ears, governance signals a notion of benevolent rules and procedure. It's sort of warm and cozy, but we tend to use it when we wish to separate rules and procedures from power. Governance refers to rules without politics. The rules seem to come from some rational procedure. Committees agree on the findings of science or reach a consensus for governance seems to incorporate a world of Habermasian values. It is curiously bloodless. If we listen to the music of public language, we might say that the invocation of governance has replaced the feel-good notion, expectation of civil society. It has taken up the discursive space of politics that civil society had assumed in 1989. Both terms carry the reassuring illusions of an apolitical future. Can appeals to governance really help the heavy lifting of politics? Much depends on its application. If governance establishes the meta rules of political rivalry, that is, if it describes what constitutional procedures will govern our debates, then the concept can serve us. If, however, it invokes a procedure that supposedly eliminates debates and party politics, it becomes an illusory idea. Too often, I suspect, the term is meant to describe government without contention, government without politics. Consider the substitutes for politics and political contention that have been proposed to run our societies in recent decades. Neoliberalism has suggested dismantling government and trusting to capitalist success. It was particularly appealing before the crisis of 2008-9, and it charmed both Tony Blair and Bill Clinton. Populism, another term, suggests mobilizing ethnic or other grievances and placing power in the hands of a demagogue who can flatter his or her supporters with assurances that they are the real people. Populism has been the pseudo-answer to the crises, not of capitalism's crises, but of capitalism's partial success, responsive to automation and technological displacement, globalization and deindustrialization. Success that raises the aggregate GDPs of society, but deeply divides them. Populists have understood the social costs of advanced capitalism, and they speak to it. Viktor Orban explained that to his adherents in 2014. Ideas of governance also constitute a technocratic vision that sees political contention yielding to technical problem solving through a polity ultimately run by algorithms. The internet was supposed to replace the society of association, that is, of intermediate bodies in the liberal sense, replace it by vast networks of people in communicative touch. Think of Facebook as a polity, as the dream of Meta and Mark Zuckerberg. These, I think, are utopian fantasies. In 1989, the populists of Eastern Europe mobilized the associations or groups that had been opened up for them in the 1970s and 1980s. These associations, civil society, could display tyrannies but found it harder to conduct daily politics. Too often, in their stead, have set utopian dreams. On one side, the neoliberal vision that markets and capital can replace much of what the state must provide. On the other side, the utopia of governance and the weird promise of loose electronic ties. All are supposed to overcome conflictuality that lies in politics and in normal states. Nonetheless, the fact remains that gouverner, c'est choisir. To govern is to choose, and thus to debate, and thus to form parties and coalitions and defeat one's opponents, at least for a while, and the expectation you may get defeated later. Given the world as it is, politics must take place within the state or other political frameworks designed for debate and legislation. This does not mean that the state has to pursue unrealistic and illusory sovereignist notions of self-sufficiency. A decision must be made in appropriately scaled political arenas. I would urge recognizing the state as the field for politics, and not just longing for civil society, valuable as it was for the breakout of 1989, but less serviceable for the challenges since. The project state or the reformist politics. This does not mean that the state must be centralized. The doctrines of subsidiarity or federalism suggest that politics can be contested at multiple locations. Personally, given the broader nature of the challenges, I feel that subsidiarity can go only so far. Our society shall have to decide policy on a national level, or even as international level, international level. But that's a debating point. Others will feel differently. Think finally of the challenges that face our societies and states. First, and this may be a more United States problem than a European one, So forgive me for bringing the whole country into the this is the problem, is assuring equal access to rights. In the United States, currently, we face confusion on access to abortion and to voting. If these are to be protected by the Constitution, and Roe versus Wade established some measure with respect to abortion, and the Civil War amendments and the Voting Rights Acts of 1964, 1965 established with respect to voting, then they must be protected in Texas as well as in New York. Second, meeting what might be termed the vertical challenge, financing the welfare state in an age of longevity, that is, of populations with more retirees and fewer citizens of working age. How do our states, and among states I include the European Union, cope with the increase in lifespan and an increasing burden on the young by the old? This problem at least can remain one of bargaining over more or less. It does not raise insuperable issues of principle. And more generally, the vertical challenge of inequality, personal and regional, as technology and finance create new fortunes and displace old livelihoods. Third, what I would face, I think, what I would term the horizontal challenge. That is the issue of who shall be admitted into the wealthy national communities, European and Americans, and who will not. We have an asymmetric regime of international migration, sanctified by treaties. They sanction the right for people to leave their states, but not to enter another state, other country. Without a narrow, this is, I'm not sure how we get around this, but whether a narrow river, Rio Grande, or a broad sea like the Mediterranean, our southern borders continually display the global rift between privilege and poverty. And that is probably the most anguishing issue in an age of increasingly turbulent climate change. How should our wealthy societies deal with the clamor of those who want to move here to escape either ruinous floods or arid land, or the descent of their respective countries into drug-fueled civil wars? As of now, we cope with this challenge by making it really difficult to enter and by deterring all but the desperate. And finally, of course, old-fashioned geopolitical violence has not disappeared. War is back. And states certainly are the privileged sites and actors of international war. States make war. War used to make states. They destroy states. A geopolitical map of the world today, I think, would look pretty similar to the one proposed by one of the founders of geopolitics, Alfred Kinder, in the early 20th century, in which an authoritarian Russian and Asian heartland had to be counterposed by the world island or the oceanic periphery, Western Europe and the United States. Civil society reveals, use that term again, the societal components of a nation. But for better or worse, the vertical, horizontal, and geopolitical challenges mean that we cannot face these current dilemmas by civil society alone. To mobilize the state means, of course, to accept ongoing political contention. This does not mean that agreement is impossible or that national projects are excluded. It does mean accepting that there will be no definitive solutions. It is tiring. Max Weber compared politics to the slow boring of hard wars. And coalitions must be built and rebuilt. We cannot shape our societies by markets or algorithms alone. And Europe and Britain, whether inside or outside Europe, the United States, and each of our political societies meet the challenge of governing beyond formulas of governance or the pseudo-solutions of populism. I believe that the issue is open. There never will be a utopian victory. That's the nature of politics and one of the few reliable lessons of history. As historians and social scientists, we participate indirectly in this world. Not all of us have the chance to speak truth to power, but our vocation calls on all of us to speak speak truth about power. We must and should help to clarify what is the state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Maier. We don't need to tell you how explicit that was, but now we can have questions from the audience. While you're probably thinking, if I can ask from my side here, I had two questions to ask you. The first thing is about civil society, where you said that it's now losing, the significance that it used to have, especially during the period towards the downfall of communism, how important it was back then. And what do we do in terms of dealing with civil society these days, when in those populist systems or illiberal systems, the societies are so divided? Who do we work with if we have anybody to work with? I mean, I'm thinking of the example of Turkey right now. Most people would say we need to work with civil society for the next 5 years of Erdogan in power. But how can we work with them when the societies are so divided in terms of polarization and different beliefs and different belief systems? And my second question to you is, what do you think of Biden's initiative on democracy?
Remember to use a microphone.
Yeah,
See you and other questions.
Yeah, okay.
I'm not sure I can answer those questions. Societies are divided. Civil society was a mode of discovering that underneath the divisions, there was a unity of opposition. Populism perhaps can recreate civil society, but it is a political strategy designed to annihilate civil society. Possible. Sort of soft version of what totalitarianism earlier had been. So, civil society that is revived will be revived by virtue of those who seek to suppress it. How we should foster those movements, I think we just have to keep encouraging opposition. Those who want to speak out, help editors, help political refugees in all sorts of ways. So I guess that would be my big answer. So that means, as we did, I guess, in the Cold War, in a sense, try to fund the good guys. The good guys may be divided differently, but it's my concern was, what do we do when, in fact, societies are not just generally degenerating into populism, when they are functioning so unequally with different people. Now, Biden's initiative on democracy. I'm sorry, I've not been listening to my president. You're referring to.
I'm referring, the conferences of democratic work. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I'm referring to the conferences that you organized, through already, and inviting democratic governments.
Well, it's great to talk with each other. What that will do. The problem is not democracy. The problem is non-democracy. I mean, so I'm all I'm all for talking together, but I think the lesson of what is that we're going to have to organize politically and push legislation through on help society to advance it, to return to a notion that you can use the political arena for welfare, education, and you can bring people up in it and restore some hope. if these conferences can do that, that's fine. I don't think of them as, I haven't really, followed them. Perhaps that may indicate something about it.
Okay, and introduce yourself, please. Yes.
Yeah, Patrick Coase, thank you so much. I like very much what you said about the centrality of politics and the state. And I wonder if the kind of the challenges that you are outlining and you focused on the transformative moment of 1989 can't be traced back much further into sort of as one of the central challenges of the 20th century. I'm thinking about all the kinds of groups that were trying, for example, to envisage a League of Nations, and then the kind of politics that was necessary to build it. And I wonder if one of the big challenges would be to distinguish between what is civil society. Aren't we talking about an emancipatory vanguard, a minority? And then the question of how do you translate that into a wider process? And the second question would be focusing on the state, but wouldn't it also be a focus on interstate politics? You mentioned geopolitics. Wouldn't we also envisage this as interstate politics?
Yeah, I did say in this, I tried to argue, I think the European Union is a state in birth, so to speak. It is a confederation of values, and the money behind the values, and increasingly now of armed force behind the values. The level of what the state is less important, it seems to me, than the notion that you have to debate at a level where one can back up a decision with more than just words. Where words can help liberate. I think words alone will help us lessen government. So, it was a great tragedy for the United States not to enter the League of Nations. Just as I believe it's a tragedy for Britain to absent itself an international organization. So I'm all in favor of that, but that's part of politics, because you have to persuade to that, and the persuasion did not, work. And other people in the United States nor in Britain.
Thank you.
Thanks for a great lecture. My name is Dimitar Bechev, and I'm at the Oxford School for Global Area Studies. I want to bring the conversation back to Central and Eastern Europe, if I may. What you saw the last decade with the rise of those liberal regimes is actually, to my mind, the rebirth of civil society. Instead of people who in the 90s were professionalized, institutionalized in NGOs and almost structured bond makers and so on, now we have much more of an organic bottom-up mobilization. I mean, you saw it in Poland, for instance, with the opposition to legislation on abortion, a theme that brings very close to the debate in the United States. You see it now in Hungary with the teachers going on strike. I mean, part of their grievances have to do with salaries, but also their substantive objections to the curriculum. So then the question is what we make of those mobilizations. We might say that these are divided societies. For every person demonstrating against law and justice, you have a supporter or a liberal civil society. Or you might say that civil society is coming back. And I was just wondering what you think, because also technology plays a role. People were very skeptical that social networks are demobilizing. But we have also evidence that they're helping those mobilizations in a much more sort of informal ways. But then again, there are other people saying that as long as you don't cast a ballot, it doesn't matter if you go and demonstrate for a couple of weeks and then you disallow us. So I was just wondering what you make of this process, which might have implications elsewhere, not just in Poland, Hungary, and those countries.
Well, the Polish demonstrations were very encouraging. But this is not different really from what I was trying to say. Perhaps I didn't make it clear that civil society emerges as an opposition to abuse of power. And it did in the 1980s, and perhaps it is again in Eastern Europe. My only question was when it was in ordinary times, when there is, or maybe ordinary times in Eastern Europe means abuse of power. It's when in times when we get beyond the confrontation, what happens to civil society then? Civil society can sustain itself. I'm grateful for the demonstrations, and perhaps they will prevail in some sense. And so far the war in Ukraine has put so much on hold in Western Europe's confrontation with Hungary and Poland, given the influx of refugees and the effort these countries are making in the war. It's unclear what will emerge, but I guess this is a plea to think of politics as a governmental activity which is not abusive, which we need, and steps in because the headiness, the exaltation of civil society, being on the street, Tim chronicled it in his book, The Magic Lantern. These were wonderful days, they're wonderful moments, but they are moments of struggle. And we don't always struggle in that level. We don't live all the time in 1789, 1848, or 1989. And how do we do politics when we're not exalted? That's the question.
David Madden, CSOX. Thank you very much. Fascinating talk. You twice invoked the image of Othon sitting, the supreme democrat, sitting isolated and alone in his palace. But he's not the only example of that. I mean, think Margaret Thatcher, think Tony Blair. There they are in number 10, surrounded by their extremely good advisors, but increasingly out of touch because they are out of touch. What's the answer?
Being out of touch. That's a good question. I think you have these images of politicians going out in the streets and walking among the people, but this is a problem that is a classic political science problem. In part, it's the bureaucracy problem, in part, it's I think the answer is you just have to start listening to people you don't want to listen to. That's not always so easy, but it's also they're out of touch. I mean, Margaret Thatcher became out of touch for a different reason than Václav Havel, I think. In fact, the person who sort of isolated Václav Havel was a card-carrying Thatcherite, if I understand that local political situation. So I think there is a tendency for all of political activity to become remote. Kafka wrote about the castle too, and it was always remote bureaucratic ordinances. So. Sir David, I would not presume, I can't presume to answer that. I am so much of a having not experienced politics that I make this analysis with great trepidation. But you have to just keep on listening and questioning. That's probably not very satisfactory. That's the best I can do.
Thank you. Well, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. It's an observation and a question. One is the observation that, as you suggested, civil society doesn't completely disappear, but it does kind of morph into different areas, and partly it's linked to its kind of historical semantic cousin of civilization itself, in terms of moving from civil society as the story of opposition to the state, and civilization certainly in its kind of 21st century incarnation as being a defense of the state. And Viktor Orban's a good example of that. He's a kind of hero of civil society in 1989. And now he's a defender of kind of European Christian civilization, an idea built on borders and ethnic identity. So that in a sense, that migration of the kind of root of civitas from kind of civil society, civilization, I think is a kind of marker of our time. The question I have is really about this idea of the state, because in your book, Project State, you draw a lot on Montesquieu, there's quite a bit on Hegel, and even FDR at various points. You want to suggest that the state is more than just a collection of interest groups, that there's something which you call transformational and transcendent. And that, I mean, I agree with that, but I think that's flying in the face of our period, in which there's a kind of sense in which, you know, that very few people are defending the idea of, I think at one point you talk about daring more state, kind of a play on Billy Brandt's daring more democracy, in an era in which it's about the dismantling of states. So, I mean, this has a very important political agenda or assertion to it. You want to speak a little bit about this
Sure.
kind of flying in the face of
the
spirit of
I
times?
do try and explicitly say I do not want a transcendent state. I don't think this is a concept which, you know, obviously is full of dangers that showed itself, and this is not, you know, this is everything we're nothing. That's not at all what I mean. I mean, the state is a sort of a machine for governing, not transcendent. And when it gets too abusive, one needs to oppose it. I mean, using its resources. The state, after all, does have huge resources. It redistributes income. The primary income distribution is very uneven. The state does protect our common defense when other states become aggressive. Ultimately, you know, the state has to decide, and that's people, you know, and the state is not something remote, though. The state has to be people who are voting and arguing, and so I realize this may have sounded that way, but you know, in the last bit of my book, I did try and condition that. I've lived a long time in the 20th century. You know, I'm not a plea for the transcendent state. It is a plea to not just dismantle it and say, hey, the economy will do all the heavy lifting. Or governance, we can sit around the table, you know, have wonderful discussions and make rules, and it's all solved. So that's what I guess. And it will sound jarring, I realize, to some people. They should read carefully.
Martin?
Martin Conway, great lecture, but I was a bit worried about this nostalgia for civil society because it has a slight end of the 20th century feel to it, doesn't it? And I think in the 21st century, isn't the reality that civil society has gone over to the other side? That the great disruptors and insurrectionary forces of the early 21st century are clearly a sort of populism involved with Trump, with Le Pen, with Salvini, with Meloni, and so on. And in that sense, there's a sense that we can't pick and choose civil society. It's become a much more contested phase of the early 21st century, in which it's become slightly simplistic to imagine that somehow some sort of new positive force will emerge out of that sort of bottom up.
Well, I'm not sure I can answer directly. In the book, I try and make a distinction between a regime and the state. Regimes are run by people with enough power to run them, governments with guns, etc., or democratic regimes. But a state, I think, that norms are important. Governance has a role to play. Norms are important. So, you know, take an example you'll be familiar with: Vichy France. Was it a state or was it a regime? That question was argued, I think, and can be argued in different ways. So let's say I'm trying to have it both ways, and shamelessly trying to have political power, but political norms. And I still think we can do it with government and the state, and not just by saying, hey, we can get rid of all of that. I don't know whether that answers you, Martin.
I'm Dyson, University of Oxford. Thank you very much. One of the real pleasures I had when I was teaching here in Oxford was reviewing your Disillusion book. And I'd like to ask you a question now that relates to not only your skills on Germany, but also as a political economist as well as a historian. I return to the European Union. In your view, given what you said about civil society and about the structural changes in Europe and beyond, do you find yourself, Charlie, being a linear optimist about the European Union? We have those on the outside desperate to get in, and some recalcitrant Brits who got out. The challenges are enormous. I mean, they're bigger than just what civil society is like. But from your Irish in Harvard, do you think we're going to make a mess of it under German leadership?
In the long run, I'm an optimist. But the question is always how long is the run? I'm just a temperament. Yeah, I'm a worrier, but I don't see catastrophe as. And I think the European Union, I have a personal stake in this. My oldest daughter is a civil servant for the European Parliament, and I don't want her to, to be out of the job. The European passports, which they I think it has done a part of good, but it's very partial job. I mean, and the enlargement issue was a great challenge. Not, it's hard to meet, and it's hard in the sense that obviously hard to crack down on the violators of some of the basic norms by withholding funds, but at the same time, these days, they are contributing to Ukrainian refugees and Ukrainian war efforts. So it's a turbulent ride, but my sense is that the EU is will be a success, and I think we are probably going. If you ask me to look ahead 30 years or whatever, I'd say it will probably live increasingly in overlapping types of interstate confederations, shared, what do we call it, variable velocity or whatever, speed for these things. And I think Europe is on its way to doing that. And look at all the privileges Britain had not to participate fully in the European Union thing. So a currency here, these rights there, I hope rights would be one of the all-encompassing, universal aspects, but I think it will come to it. We are really, this incredibly tragic, atavistic war in the East is, war world is a wild card. So, but if we can solve that, I think we're going to.
Did you comment on the German hegemony that I'm reading?
That I decided I'd let go. So I had German hegemony. I've written on that, I guess. But it's been, it's not the resources for leadership. I think in general, it's, with some rough instances like the Greek, it's not really the hegemonic card very consistently. And I want to, I'm not that worried. There should be, but I'm not. I don't come from a small state. That's
true.
Timothy Gartner, thanks very much, Charlie. And I absolutely agree that too little attention was paid in post-communist Central and Eastern Europe to the state. But I want to put to you a proposition on civil society, which is that what Dimo Bechev was describing, namely civil society coming back in that form of oppositional mass mobilization in Poland and Hungary is actually the symptom of a failure. It comes back in a form which looks familiar from the 1980s, right? And that's a symptom of a failure. The failure is to make the transition from, to use your term, Zivilgesellschaft to Bürgerliche Gesellschaft. That is to say, from a strategy of social self-organization for regime change, which is essentially what civil society was in the 1980s, to what Marx was talking about, which is civic and social organizations whose key feature is they are economically independent of the state and other sources of power. Hence, Bürgerliche Gesellschaft, bourgeois and civic, right? Like, say, Oxford University or Harvard College, right? Civic and social institutions which, due to their economic independence, are in a position to play this critical role. Now, what happened in Central and Eastern Europe is that never quite happened, because the civic and social institutions either depended on NGOs. Someone famously said, we dreamed of civil society and got NGOs, depended on George Soros, most of them, or depended on ministries, or depended on the foundations of state-owned enterprises, or depended on business people who were somehow dependent on the current government. And so when an Orban or a Kaczynski comes to power, they lose those sources of support, and it proves very fragile, right? So the state-owned enterprises run scared, the business people run scared because they depend on the government for contracts, and then maybe foreign funding is made illegal. So my question to you, isn't the real failure not so much the one you describe as a failure to make a transition to, so to speak, an older and more traditional form of civil society?
I would be willing to agree with that. I hadn't set that as, considered it really as my problem. My problem was hey, where is this term gone? Why this great silence of it? But what you're suggesting is that it didn't accomplish what it should have accomplished. But I think that was in its nature, because the people who theorized it, who talked about it, who led it, were oppositional. This is, I think we're looking at maybe two generations. I'm not sure in 1990 they could have reduced this change. What would it have taken? And I'm not sure. Poland is a country, after all. You had the church as an oppositional force, but the church certainly did not want necessarily a vibrant civil society in post-transition Poland. And the Czechs physically divided the country. So I will accept it. And I'll have to think further about it. I'm not sure Bürgerliche Gesellschaft is, is the term I would use for that. A society, a pluralist society.
Well, these answer Othon, and I shouldn't be talking, but Tim's question and your question are actually the same. They're on the same line, and I've been thinking about your question since you asked it. So you asked a question about Turkey and states like Turkey. And part of our problem here, I think, is that we're talking about democracies on the edge, like the one Charlie and I live in. And then we're talking about countries that are kind of over the edge, or more over the edge. And your question was, how do we help civic actors? I'm going to call them civic actors. And how do we help civic actors in places like Turkey, where they're deeply threatened? And Tim's observation was that Western, to use a crappy term, Western assistance to the civil society groups that helped make 1989 was a poison gift. And it made them dependent on outside help. They didn't generate their own. It's not just financial support. It was they didn't do what they needed to do in order to keep a mass base. And so in the end, there was a problem. And so my question was, if we think back to Ostpolitik, so let's try to simplify it a little and at least think where we've got a record. If we think back to the SPD in the pre-unification period and Dayton and all the things that the West, again, to use the crude term, the West tried to do to encourage change in countries that were under communism. How do we tell that story now? And is that a good example or a bad example of avoiding? Seems to me that some of that was better than some of what we're doing now.
If I just add a word, I mean, for me, it's not just a failure on the part of the activists. It's a failure on the part of the business community to create a genuinely independent bourgeoisie, genuinely independent economic actors, so that you're not dependent on NGOs, right? It's not the AstroTurf. You have your genuine sources. So you have major private universities, for example, you have major private foundations which have a strong domestic base. That, for me, is a significant part of the failure, because what then happened in Poland and Hungary is independent little magazines, for example, suddenly find their funding disappears or is made illegal.
Well, all right, then. Believe it or not, I'm getting a phone call. That's technology of the West. If you have hearing aids, you can get your phone messages directly into your cerebrum. It's a dubious advance, as some of the Western innovations are. Were we asking, I'd asked him, I mean, how were these, so you go from a state-regulated, state-owned economy in many senses, the agrarian sector accepted, how do you go directly to a robust business community? I don't know, we had a wonderful little incident. There was a Polish company, independent computer company, they made little computers, and they were in the Tatra mountains, and the man set out a package called the Veritas computer. And this was about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago now. And here he had packaged these wonderful, those were Macs, with they were a very good product actually, in packages that had Harvard logos all over. And I was sent on a mission to Eastern Europe to talk to the owner and tell him, you can't really do that. We had a committee on the use of foreign, on the overseas use of trademarks and stuff, and which I did. I trundled off to the major city of Tatra, the name of the city here at the moment, and very nice, and they changed it. But this was a perfect entrepreneur in your sense. He had a wonderful product, but come on, in Poland in the 1990s or early 2000s, he was going to compete with Apple, and they faced huge disadvantages, I think, vis-a-vis the West in terms of what they could build from the ground up. And so it became much easier for Hungary, found its vocation as sort of a auto parts are sent by train overnight from South Germany into Hungary. They're assembled there. They're sent back. I'm not sure. In a sense, we asked I think you ask too much, I don't know how universities, they could do better, so I don't think it was a question that we kept nursing them, so to speak, too excessively or too long. I think what happened was this transition was tremendously difficult, and for East Germany, also, it led to a lot of structural unemployment. West Germans could just pay people so they could keep their income, but they obviously didn't restore what you would have liked or I would have liked. So I think it's I'm not sure. I would have said the economic basis of bringing the Gesellschaft will take some time. And I think we were told that. I mean, I read a very interesting PhD thesis on Afghanistan. This is from before 7 or 8 years ago. But not written by another Tim. But I read last name, but said he had served in Afghanistan. He said, I went there, he said, this country, there was no government, there was no state, it was all NGOs. And so this was a country of NGO, an authority of NGOs. And we saw what happened to it. It was faced with pretty ruthless forces. And we were not ready to intervene and continue protection. So these are real dilemmas, and when you have an onrushing technological transformation, ask a country to step up to produce, to become economically viable in the new technology, new world, I think it's very difficult.
Yes.
I'm not academic quicker. My question is, going back to Turkey, on the hordes of the broad-minded and prestigious people, all in jail. Have they a voice?
What? Oh, have they a voice? Have they a voice? Is that what you asked?
Are they completely silent?
I don't know. I'm not an expert on Turkey. I know almost next to nothing about Turkey. We do know that 52 to 49%, and of the 49%, the alternative was not so attractive either. It's I don't know if they're all silent, but they are pretty much neutral, ineffective. But I'll refer on that question of voice. What voice is very difficult. We had Albert Hirschman's very lovely essay, Exit Voice of Loyalty. But in fact, it was exit from the East Germans in 1989, the possibility of exit from Hungary, that let the others at home have voice. These are all interdependent types of strategies. So I'm sorry to not be able to satisfy you.
If I can just add on this, on the Turkish experience, I mean, I think one of the most disappointing developments that we are seeing under the circumstances is how people are self-censoring themselves. I think that's the trickiest part, because even if they feel in the way that they feel, they're actually afraid of expressing themselves. And that's I think one of the successes of the regime in Turkey at the moment. Yes. You have a question, right?
No, it's okay. Okay, I was asking.
Oh, yeah, got it.
I'm wondering if there isn't, my name is Ruth Harris, and I'm wondering if there isn't a disjunction between what you said about these momentous moments of exaltation and the politics of a revived state, where people have to accept compromise, hard work, and all the other things. I mean, how do you see any appetite for people not wanting to live without a sense of exalted emotion? It seems to me that, on the contrary, that so much of populism is about maintaining that exaltation, and that there is underneath that, in these democratic societies, a loss of trust and belief and undermining, even by those who think they believe in it. So the question is, isn't it very difficult to rally a vision of a state that has something to offer if what it really has to offer is not very exciting, but just this hard graft and, you know, the things that we associate with the politics of compromise.
I would agree with that. I wouldn't agree that populism is offering a type of exaltation. It's offering often a type of hostility and you know, I guess this evoking standard, you know, types of antagonism, enmity. So I wouldn't, but this is always the issue with political transformation. How do you sustain it? I like very much the sociologist or anthropologist Victor Turner, who has developed, it's not the only one, there's an Italian, who the notion of liminality, which he sees like it's no accident. He said that it was his last that passed away. He was Catholic. He was very much in the notions of communion and life. That one lives in a cycle between exaltation or between what he called liminality, destructuring, and then return to structure. And this is the difficulty. This was the difficulty with 68, I think, for us students, that they had no vision of what came after the Grand Journée, the great rally. And I would argue that the true task of reform politics is to create a new structure that can sustain us when we're not exalted.
Exactly.
That's not easy.
Can I just come back quickly and say that I wouldn't quite agree with you about the notion of exaltation, that there is something about the exaltation of hate that you mentioned when you made the comparison between National Socialism and the New Deal. And I think that there was exaltation in that hate. And I think we're naive to think that only in progressive moments is there exaltation.
This is true, but I wasn't thinking so much of the New Third Reich or the New Deal as regimes of exaltation, you know, regimes of liminality. Yes, you can whip up a crowd and make different things.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I'm Eamon Noonan. I'm in fact a European Parliament public service myself. I'm here as a visiting fellow this year. It's my great delight and wonderful to hear your comments. Going back to 1989, the question that occurs to me is that, well, in the transition, the European Union, as well as the US, framed its priority as democratization based on the realization of civil and political rights, the absence of which had been a huge priority right through the Civil War and frequently raised. It also concentrated on an economic transition, but did not base that on economic.
Sorry, wait a second. I'm going to turn this thing. Say it again.
Okay, so the point is that the Western or the European Union effort didn't focus on the economic and social rights aspect of economic transformation. And indeed, I heard recently that US advisors were advising countries not to include economic and social rights in their constitutions. So would you agree with that? That was a gap, and would you, and that possibly contributed to the negative outcomes we have so many years later?
Well, I'm not sure economic and social rights as applied to Eastern Europe. Yes, I mean, there'll always be, caricature, there'll always be representatives of the economy, of business, and so we'll say, we can't afford certain rights. I mean, we have this now, Starbucks and its workers and Amazon, and there'll always be a contest over who rights, and I don't. It's always amusing to me to read in the FT or the Wall Street Journal that alas, the economy is doing so well that the markets are down, or there's a bigger. So I don't know what economic and social rights were not insisted on and were insisted on. I mean, surely they did. They must have been. Maybe you can be more specific about which ones.
Okay, well, worker protections, minimum wages, and a regime of social protection that would have moved towards levels in Western Europe, standards that are.
Well, I think the Germans faced this obviously. How quickly did you equalize wages? What did you protect? I mean, and they made the decision to protect a certain amount of acquired property, that is savings accounts. A conversion. Smart. And I think they had to, and I don't know what was not. I can't be more specific. I'm sorry, I don't know what was protected and what was not, or what was sacrificed. This is one of the tasks I think of politics, of government, to say, look, we got a minimum wage. You want $15 an hour. People in this community wants it $7.50 an hour. That seems to me something we bargain at, and we go to $12 and later. So I don't know whether that was really a fatal flaw that we worked out.
And we've got Paul, right? Paul,
I'm Paul Faber. I just wanted to explore a little bit more about the relationship between the state and civil society, which is at the root of your lecture. And you had so many interesting comments about it. And I'm wondering that when there are periods when civil society is dormant or somehow failing in its democratic role to keep the state in check in terms of monitoring it and so on. What is the, I mean, it's been touched on before, what is the kind of motivational force that we could engender? And it seems, and I'm wondering whether you might think of that as a kind of enabling state. In other words, that in the positive periods when civil society is flourishing, it leaves markers so that the state can continue to support civil society bodies, but not to the point that they don't become independent. That's Tim's very, very strong point. Not that they become dependent, but somehow leave markers so that they can, in a sense, continue during these fallow periods and be ready to function again when they need to check the authoritarian state.
Well,
I mean, can we think of the state as a kind of enabling state that doesn't swallow up civil society institutions, but does somehow protect them?
Yes, we can think of it, and I think it's a question of how to encourage it. I mean, I think states should, we have different forums for debate, and I guess I'm less interested in your question. Makes me think the task would be not necessarily to encourage particular associations, whether university. I mean, it should encourage associations, but not necessarily. The task should be to encourage participation and discussion among the atoms of civil society. That is citizenship, which isn't quite the same as the civil society as a group of independent countervailing associations. So I don't think we can say we should encourage labor rights, but we don't have to encourage particular trade union as such. I think it's very, you know, and I would do it on an issue by issue basis. But you know, the ground rules of democracy can certainly be insisted on. That is that there be place for discussion. This is why it's not what's happening in some of our states with voting rights issues is deplorable, because that is a discussion discouragement, not a civil society in the sense of intermediate bodies. It is a discouragement of citizenship and cool in itself. So I would try and preserve that distinction if education is always enabling aspects of education. I mean, you know, the federal government in your system, which is yours is not a federal government, but and ours has stepped in with a huge degree of financing over the last 30 years for all sorts of, you know, initiatives and needs, and I think that's perfectly appropriate.
Thank you very much, Professor Maier. I've got one last question for you. And then we finish. Now, I believe that the political scientists are the worst to ask predictions, but historians are much better to ask about their future predictions. But I want to ask you and expand on Annie's question and Icon's question. To ask you whether you're hopeful about the EU. I wanted to ask you whether you're hopeful about the US democracy.
I have to be open about it. It's my democracy. I live there. My time in it is probably limited, but my children's time is longer, and my grandchildren's even longer. I cannot admit to it being expressed. So that's sort of a categorical imperative there. What's on, and I'll just say, you know, whether hopeful or not, I think it's something, you know. It's not like, you know, people take up hopelessness. Think of the rebels in the Warsaw Ghetto elsewhere. Thank God we don't have that degree of you know, challenge or struggle ahead. But I'm hopeful that we will, you know, come through this. I'm always impressed by journalists will always tell you, I'm always we've never seen anything like this before. And historians will always tell you, we've seen it all before. You know, somewhere in the middle, we've seen some of it before. But yes, I will remain. I can be hopeful and a pessimist at the same time, although I'm generally pretty optimistic in the long run. And what the next 10 years. I are taking bets.
Thank you so much. It's been a terrific annual lecture for this year. We really appreciate you and your wife coming here to us. I hope you enjoyed it as well. We did thoroughly. And I hope you enjoyed coming back to St. Antony's, that it's been as good as you remember it. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, everyone. It's a nice reunion.